My name is Bethany Caldwell. 3 years ago, I stood in a white wedding dress waiting to marry the man I believed I would spend the rest of my life with. Instead, I watched him leave me for my best friend while my own parents told me to stop making a scene because Jason had chosen the woman who could help our family climb higher in society. My brother even congratulated him and called it the smartest decision he had ever made. In less than 24 hours, I lost my fiancé, my best friend, and the family I had spent my entire life trying to make proud. For months, I believed them when they said I wasn't successful enough, attractive enough, ambitious enough, or important enough to stand beside people like Jason. I believed I had failed because the people I loved kept repeating it until it became my own voice. But while they celebrated my humiliation, I quietly rebuilt my life where none of them were looking. They never asked where I disappeared to. They never wondered why I stopped calling. They simply assumed I had accepted my place beneath them. Tonight, every one of them believed I had returned, hoping for forgiveness, another chance, or at least one final conversation. They had absolutely no idea I was walking into Apex Innovations as the woman who was about to expose the biggest financial fraud in the company's history, and every person who had laughed at me was standing directly in the path of what was coming. The Apex Innovations Charity Gala was the most prestigious corporate event in Chicago. Billionaires shook hands beneath crystal chandeliers, while politicians posed for photographers and television crews waited outside, hoping to capture the city's most powerful executives arriving on the red carpet. Every conversation sounded expensive. Every smile hid another business deal. Every guest wore confidence like another piece of jewelry. Jason loved this world because it made him feel untouchable. I stepped through the revolving glass doors wearing nothing more than a simple black evening dress beneath a fitted blazer. No diamonds. No designer labels that screamed for attention. No entourage. I had learned that real power almost never announced itself. It simply arrived. The moment I entered the lobby, people began whispering, "Isn't that Bethany Caldwell?" I thought she disappeared after Jason dumped her. What is she doing here? Didn't she end up working in accounting somewhere? This is going to be embarrassing. I kept walking without acknowledging a single word. Their opinions had once controlled my life. Tonight they were nothing more than background noise. Before I reached the registration desk, Jason stepped directly into my path wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo and the same confident smile that had once convinced me he would never betray me. Standing beside him was Monica, the woman who had once cried with me after every argument Jason and I ever had while secretly sleeping with him behind my back. Her emerald green gown shimmered beneath the ballroom lights, but my attention stopped on something else. Around her neck hung my grandmother's diamond pendant, the necklace my grandmother had promised would one day belong to me. The necklace my parents claimed had been lost years ago. Monica noticed where I was looking and smiled before gently touching the diamond. "You still recognize it," she said. Jason laughed. "Of course she does." Monica tilted her head with fake sympathy. "Your mother said it looked much better on someone who actually knows how to represent the Caldwell family." Several nearby guests laughed quietly. I looked from the necklace to Jason. "So they gave it to you." Jason shrugged without the slightest hint of guilt. "Let's be honest, Bethany. Monica fits into your family much better than you ever did." 3 years earlier, those words would have shattered me. Tonight, they simply confirmed everything I already knew. My parents had never lost the necklace. They had chosen who deserved it, and they had not chosen their own daughter. Monica stepped closer. "Jason told me you still haven't moved on." She smiled sweetly. "That's actually kind of sad." Jason folded his arms. "You really thought you belonged here?" Before I could answer, my older brother Brandon joined them, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. He looked at me with complete disappointment. "Mom and Dad were right. You just can't let go. Every time this family moves forward, you find another way to embarrass us." Jason smiled. "Security has already been told to keep an eye on you." Monica laughed. "You should leave before they escort you out." Brandon took a sip of champagne without looking away from me. "You were never meant for rooms like this, Bethany. Some people are born to lead. Others should learn where they belong." For a brief second, the three of them stood together, smiling as if they had already won. They believed I was alone. They believed I had returned to beg for acceptance. They believed they still controlled my story. None of them noticed the encrypted authorization screen already open on my phone. None of them recognized the executive clearance code glowing across the display. And none of them realized that in less than 2 minutes, the most powerful man inside Apex Innovations would walk through those ballroom doors because I had just arrived. The registration desk was only a few steps away when the atmosphere inside the ballroom suddenly changed. Conversations grew quieter. Several executives instinctively stepped aside as an elderly man in a dark tailored suit walked through the private entrance surrounded by two security officers. Harrison Cole, the founder and chairman of Apex Innovations, rarely attended public events anymore. At 72 years old, every appearance he made became tomorrow's business headlines. Jason immediately straightened his jacket and smiled confidently before walking toward him, clearly expecting another opportunity to impress the man whose approval every executive inside the company desperately wanted. Monica quickly adjusted the diamond necklace around her neck while Brandon whispered, "Watch this. Jason practically has this company in his pocket." I remained exactly where I was. Harrison Cole looked across the crowded ballroom without acknowledging anyone who greeted him. His eyes moved from table to table until they stopped on me. The expression on his face immediately softened. Then, to everyone's complete confusion, he changed direction and walked straight toward where I was standing. Jason stepped forward with his hand already extended. "Mr. Cole, it's wonderful to see you again." Harrison never even looked at him. He continued walking until he stopped directly in front of me. Every conversation inside the ballroom died instantly. Harrison smiled warmly before extending both hands toward me. "Miss Caldwell," he said loud enough for dozens of nearby guests to hear, "I've been waiting for you." Jason's smile froze. Monica slowly lowered her champagne glass. Brandon stared at Harrison in complete disbelief. I shook Harrison's hand politely. "I'm sorry I'm a few minutes late." Harrison laughed softly. "When you're the most important person in the building, everyone else can wait." Complete silence filled the ballroom. Jason finally forced a nervous smile. "Mr. Cole, I think there must be some misunderstanding." Harrison turned toward him for the first time. "Is there?" Jason cleared his throat. "Bethany doesn't work for Apex." Harrison looked back at me before smiling again. "Not yet." Then he reached inside his jacket and removed a sealed navy blue envelope embossed with the Apex Innovations executive seal. He handed it directly to me. "Would you mind opening this now?" Hundreds of curious eyes followed every movement of my hands as I slowly broke the seal. Inside was a formal appointment letter signed by every voting member of the board of directors. Harrison asked quietly, "Would you read the first paragraph out loud?" I looked down at the page before speaking clearly. "Effective immediately. Bethany Caldwell is hereby appointed Interim Chief Executive Officer of Apex Innovations with full executive authority granted by unanimous resolution of the Board of Directors, pending completion of the corporate forensic investigation." Someone dropped a champagne glass somewhere. Behind us. The sound shattered the silence. Jason's face turned completely white. "That's impossible." Monica looked at Brandon. "She's lying." Harrison calmly took the letter back and handed Jason another copy bearing the original board seal. "Feel free to verify every signature." Jason's hands trembled as he scanned the document. One by one, the signatures matched. Chairman, Vice Chair, Independent Directors, Legal Counsel. Every signature was genuine. Brandon stepped forward. "This has to be a joke." Harrison's expression became cold. "The only joke is how long this company has tolerated people who confuse arrogance with leadership." He turned back toward me. "Miss Caldwell, your executive credentials have already been activated. The boardroom is prepared whenever you're ready." Jason finally found his voice. "Why her?" Harrison looked directly into. No one applauded. No one spoke. Hundreds of people simply stared at me as though the ground beneath the ballroom had shifted beneath their feet. A few executives who had been laughing with Jason only moments earlier quietly stepped away from him without saying a word. Others immediately pulled out their phones, sending frantic messages to people who were not in the room. Reputation in the corporate world could change in seconds, and everyone present understood they had just witnessed one of those moments. Jason remained frozen, still holding the appointment letter as though reading it again might somehow change the words printed across the page. Monica slowly removed her hand from his arm. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Brandon forced a laugh, trying to convince himself this was only some elaborate publicity stunt, but even he no longer sounded confident. Harrison glanced around the ballroom before speaking once more. The gala will continue as scheduled. However, beginning tonight, all executive financial records, internal communications, and access logs are placed under immediate preservation order. No files are to be deleted. No servers are to be accessed without written authorization from Miss Caldwell. The room instantly became even quieter. Several senior executives exchanged worried looks. They understood exactly what those words meant. This was no ceremonial appointment. Someone inside Apex Innovations was about to be investigated. Harrison then turned toward me and smiled calmly. "Bethany, the board has been waiting. They're ready whenever you are." I nodded once, then looked directly at Jason. He still hadn't moved. The confident man who had mocked me only minutes earlier now looked like someone desperately trying to calculate how much I already knew. I smiled politely before walking past him. As I reached the private elevator reserved for board members, I heard Harrison quietly say something that Jason was never supposed to hear. "By tomorrow morning," he said, "everyone responsible will wish they had never underestimated you." The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside without looking back. What Jason didn't know was that becoming interim CEO had never been my real objective. It was only the key that would unlock every secret hidden inside Apex Innovations. Oh, his eyes. Because while you spent the last 3 years chasing promotions, titles, and attention, Bethany spent those same 3 years quietly uncovering evidence that someone inside this company has stolen millions of dollars from our shareholders. Jason's breathing became noticeably heavier. Monica's confident smile disappeared. Brandon looked from me to Jason, suddenly unsure of everything he believed only moments earlier. Harrison took one final step closer and spoke loudly enough for every executive nearby to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to formally introduce the woman leading Apex Innovations' independent forensic investigation." Every head in the ballroom turned toward me. Harrison smiled proudly. "Our new interim chief executive officer, Miss Bethany Caldwell." The ballroom erupted into stunned whispers. Some executives immediately stood. Others looked toward Jason, trying to understand what had just happened. I looked directly at Jason as the color drained from his face. He had spent 3 years convincing everyone I was a failure. In less than 60, the private elevator doors closed behind me, sealing off the noise from the ballroom below. For the first time that evening, complete silence surrounded me. Harrison Cole stood beside me with his hands folded over the silver handle of his cane, watching the floor numbers slowly climb toward the executive level. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. He finally smiled. "You handled that better than I expected." I looked at my reflection in the polished steel doors. "I've had 3 years to prepare for tonight." Harrison nodded. "Good. Because what happens next will be much harder than humiliating your ex-fiancé." The elevator stopped. On the 38th floor. The doors opened directly into the executive boardroom, a room very few employees had ever entered. 12 directors were already waiting around a massive walnut conference table. Some were retired CEOs. Others represented the company's largest institutional investors. Every one of them stood as Harrison and I entered. 3 years ago, I would have been terrified simply walking into this room. Tonight, I wasn't afraid of anyone sitting at that table. I was afraid of failing the thousands of employees who had no idea their company had been quietly robbed for years. Harrison walked to the head of the table before turning toward the directors. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "our investigation officially begins now." Every eye shifted toward me. Harrison motioned for me to sit in the chair beside him. "Miss Caldwell," he continued, "before we discuss evidence, I think everyone deserves to understand why you're here." He nodded toward one of the directors. An older woman slid a thick folder across the table. My name was printed across the cover. Harrison smiled. 3 years ago, after Jason resigned from your consulting firm and joined Apex, I hired an outside agency to evaluate every senior financial analyst working in Chicago. Your file reached my desk 6 months later. One of the directors added, "Highest forensic accounting score we've ever seen." Another smiled. "Zero ethics violations. Zero compliance failures." Every fraud investigation she participated in resulted in successful prosecution. Harrison looked directly at me. "You never knew we were watching?" I shook my head. "No." "Good," he replied. "Because the people we're investigating never knew either." He pressed a button on the conference table. The giant screen covering the far wall lit up. Hundreds of financial transactions appeared across multiple companies. At first glance, they looked completely ordinary. Vendor payments, consulting fees, software licensing, international transfers, the kind of reports executives approved every day without reading twice. Harrison handed me a remote. "Show them." I stood and slowly walked toward the screen. "For the past 14 months, I began. I've been working undercover as an independent compliance consultant hired through a third-party auditing firm." Several directors exchanged surprised glances. None of the executives under investigation knew I was assigned specifically to Apex. I pressed the first slide. A complicated flowchart filled the screen. At first, I believed the company had a simple accounting problem. I was wrong. I highlighted 7 different corporations registered in Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands. These companies appear unrelated. Another click. Red lines connected every corporation. They're all controlled by the same network. I zoomed in again. 3 names appeared beside the ownership records. Jason Mercer, Brandon Caldwell, Monica Ellis. Complete silence filled the boardroom. One director slowly removed his glasses. "You're telling us 3 executives created an international laundering network inside Apex?" "Not just created it," I answered. "They've been operating it for almost 3 years." Another director frowned. "How much money?" I clicked again. The number appeared across the screen. $48,732,000. No one spoke. Harrison quietly closed his eyes. Even he had not expected the amount to be that high. I continued. "The money wasn't stolen all at once. It disappeared through thousands of small transactions designed to look like routine consulting expenses." Another slide appeared. Every fraudulent payment stayed below the automatic audit threshold. Harrison smiled slightly. "Which means they assumed no one would ever notice." "Exactly." I enlarged another document. "Until someone compared every transaction instead of reviewing them one by one." A younger director leaned forward. "Can you prove Jason approved these payments personally?" I nodded. "Yes." I opened a secure folder containing dozens of digitally signed approvals. Every authorization came from executive credentials assigned to Jason Mercer. "Brandon?" another director asked. I displayed another spreadsheet. He approved every fake vendor contract. "And Monica?" "She created the public relations firms used to disguise the transfers." The room became impossibly quiet. Harrison finally stood. "Ladies and gentlemen." He looked around the table before continuing. "This is no longer an internal ethics issue." He turned toward me. "This is organized corporate fraud." Before anyone could respond, the conference room doors burst open. Jason walked inside without knocking, his face flushed with anger. 2 security officers followed behind him, trying unsuccessfully to stop him. "This meeting isn't authorized," Jason shouted. "She has no right to access confidential financial records." Harrison didn't even look at him. "Actually, she does." Jason slammed both hands against the conference table. "This is a mistake." I slowly turned toward him. "Is it?" I picked up a blue folder lying beside my laptop. "Then maybe you can explain why your personal authorization code approved 47 payments to a company that doesn't actually exist." Jason stared at the folder. Every drop of color disappeared from his face. He recognized the document immediately, because it was the one file he believed no one would ever find. To seconds, He had become an employee standing in front of the woman, who now had the authority to investigate every financial decision he had ever made. And judging by the fear in his eyes, he had finally realized that I hadn't come to the gala looking for revenge. I had come to collect evidence. Jason stared at the blue folder as though it contained a loaded weapon. He recognized it instantly because only 4 people inside Apex Innovations even knew the file existed. Harrison Cole calmly looked around the boardroom before speaking. "Mr. Mercer, since you've interrupted this meeting, perhaps you'll help answer a few questions." Jason quickly regained his composure. Years of manipulating investors had taught him never to panic in public. He forced a smile and looked toward the directors. "Ladies and gentlemen, everything you're seeing has been taken completely out of context. Bethany worked for a competing consulting firm. She doesn't understand how multinational transactions operate." One director frowned. "Then explain them." Jason nodded confidently. "International consulting agreements are complicated. Shell companies are sometimes used for tax efficiency. There's nothing illegal about that." Before anyone else could respond, I connected my laptop to the main screen again. "He's right," I said calmly. "Shell companies are not illegal," Jason smiled, believing he had regained control. "Thank you." I looked directly at him. "Using fake shell companies to invoice work that never existed is." His smile disappeared. I opened the first document. "This company, Silver Horizon Consulting, billed Apex Innovations $9 million over 22 months. I enlarged the contract. According to Jason Mercer, they provided executive risk analysis. Another click revealed the incorporation records. Silver Horizon has no employees. Another click. No office. Another. No tax filings. Another. No business license outside a rented mailbox in Nevada. The directors began whispering among themselves. Jason interrupted immediately. "Those records are incomplete." I calmly opened another file. "Then perhaps these photographs will help." High-resolution images appeared on the screen showing the registered business address. Instead of an office building, it was nothing more than a small mailbox rental store. Harrison slowly folded his hands together. $9 million, he said quietly. D to a mailbox. No one laughed. The room had become too serious for that. Jason looked toward Brandon, silently hoping for support. Brandon immediately stood. "This proves nothing." He pointed toward the screen. "Thousands of companies outsource services." I nodded. "Absolutely." I pressed another button. "Which is why I hired investigators to locate every consultant Silver Horizon supposedly employed." The next slide appeared. 23 names filled the screen. Every one of them had signed sworn statements confirming they had never worked for Silver Horizon. Some had never even heard the company name before. Brandon's confidence faded. "That's impossible." "No," I replied quietly. "This is impossible." Another document appeared. Bank transfer records. Every payment sent to Silver Horizon was automatically transferred again within 48 hours. Red arrows connected the accounts until they reached one final destination: a private investment account registered under Brandon Caldwell Holdings. Complete silence filled the room. Brandon stared at the screen without blinking. Harrison slowly turned toward him. "Would you like to explain why company money ended up inside your private investment account?" Brandon didn't answer. Jason immediately stepped in. "That's an authorized management fund." I opened another folder. "Then perhaps you'll explain why the management fund purchased a 72-foot yacht 6 weeks later." A photograph of the luxury yacht appeared across the giant screen. Another click displayed the purchase agreement. Owner: Brandon Caldwell Holdings. Another click revealed the payment confirmation originating from the same account that had received Apex's consulting money. One director removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. "Good God." Harrison remained completely expressionless. "Continue." I nodded and opened another financial map. Silver Horizon wasn't the only company. 7 more corporations appeared. Every one existed only on paper. Everyone billed Apex millions of dollars. Everyone transferred money through identical banking patterns before ending inside accounts connected to Jason, Brandon, Monica, or trusts controlled by their associates. One elderly director quietly asked, "How long?" I looked at the timeline. 34 months. Total losses? $48.7 million. Nobody spoke. Even the security officers standing beside the door were staring at the screen. Jason suddenly laughed. It wasn't confidence anymore. It sounded desperate. "You're making assumptions." I looked at him. "No." I held up a flash drive. "I'm following your emails." His face changed instantly. Harrison noticed it immediately. Emails? I inserted the encrypted drive into the system. Hundreds of internal messages appeared. Some discussed fake vendor contracts. Others instructed finance employees to split invoices below mandatory audit limits. One message from Jason read, "Never let a single payment exceed the compliance threshold. Small transactions never attract attention." Another message from Brandon read, "Delete all drafts after approval. Keep nothing on company servers." Monica's email followed moments later. "Media campaign ready if anyone starts asking questions. We'll destroy credibility before they find evidence." No one in the boardroom moved. Harrison slowly looked toward Jason. "Did you write these?" Jason swallowed. "Anyone can fake emails." I smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I expected you to say." I clicked one final file. The company's cybersecurity director appeared in a recorded statement explaining that every email had been recovered directly from Apex's secure backup servers using digital forensic software. The metadata confirmed they had never been altered. Timestamps, IP addresses, device IDs, everything matched. Jason slowly stepped backward until he hit the conference table. He finally understood something that hadn't crossed his mind before walking into the room. I hadn't come with accusations. I had come with proof. Harrison Cole stood and looked around the boardroom. Effective immediately, Jason Mercer, Brandon Caldwell, and Monica Ellis are suspended from all executive authority pending criminal investigation. Before anyone could react, Jason's phone vibrated loudly. He glanced down at the screen, and for the first time since I had known him, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. Someone had just sent him a single message. "The FBI has requested access to your financial records." The moment Jason saw the blue folder in my hands, something changed in his eyes. It lasted less than a second, but I caught it. Fear. Not the fear of being accused. The fear of realizing someone had found something that was never supposed to exist. Harrison Cole noticed it too. He slowly leaned back in his chair and folded his hands without saying a word. Men like Harrison had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar deals. They understood that guilty people rarely panicked because someone asked questions. They panicked when they no longer knew what evidence existed. Jason quickly forced another confident smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, looking around the boardroom instead of at me. "I understand this looks dramatic, but financial reports without context can be very misleading." One director frowned. "Then give us the context." Jason nodded immediately. "Apex has expanded internationally over the last several years. That requires outside consultants, temporary vendors, and specialized service providers. Large corporations move money every day. Looking at a few documents without understanding the full picture can create completely false conclusions." Several directors quietly nodded. It sounded reasonable. That was exactly why Jason had survived inside Apex for so long. He always knew how to make complicated things sound perfectly normal. I didn't interrupt him. I simply waited until he finished. Then I opened the folder and removed a single invoice. Just one. Not 20. Not 100. One sheet of paper. I placed it on the large screen behind me. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly. "Large companies pay consultants every day." Jason smiled. "Exactly." I looked at the invoice again. "Would you tell the board what this company does?" Jason barely glanced at it. "Executive Strategy Consulting." "Interesting." I zoomed in on the company name. "How many employees does this consulting firm have?" Jason shrugged. "I don't know. One?" Silence. 10? Jason didn't answer. 100? He looked annoyed now. I don't memorize employee records. I nodded. Neither do I. Another click. A photograph replaced the invoice. It showed a small mailbox rental store sitting beside a gas station in Nevada. Several directors leaned closer. This, I said quietly, is the company's official headquarters. Nobody spoke. Jason frowned. That's just a mailing address. Correct. I changed the photograph again. This is the inside. Rows of tiny mailboxes filled the screen. No office. Another click. No employees. Another. No reception desk. Another. No conference room. The room became noticeably quieter. I looked back at Jason. $9 million left Apex over the last 2 years and arrived here. I pointed toward the tiny mailbox on the screen. Would you like to explain what kind of consulting work is performed inside mailbox number 43? No one laughed. Jason didn't either. He stared at the photograph without blinking. A thin line of sweat appeared near his temple. Harrison noticed it immediately, but remained silent. Jason finally cleared his throat. Some consulting firms use registered mailing services. Absolutely. I agreed. That's why I hired private investigators to locate the consultants who supposedly worked on these projects. I slowly opened another envelope. Would you like to meet them? Jason's confidence slipped for the first time. What are you talking about? I pressed the remote. Instead of spreadsheets, the screen displayed short recorded interviews. One after another, people appeared looking directly into the camera. My name is David Harper. I've never worked for Silver Horizon Consulting. The next person appeared. I'm Emily Ross. Someone used my resume without my permission. Another face. I have no idea what Apex Innovations is. Another. That signature isn't mine. One after another. 5 people. 7 people. 10 people. Every witness destroyed another piece of Jason's story. Nobody in the boardroom was looking at the screen anymore. They were all watching Jason. He loosened his tie for the first time that evening. His breathing became slower but heavier, like a man trying desperately not to show panic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply asked one question. Jason, if these people never worked for Apex, who did $47 million actually pay? For the first time since I had walked into the ballroom downstairs, Jason couldn't answer. He opened his mouth, looked toward Brandon, then back at Harrison. Nothing came out. And in that long silence, everyone in the room realized the investigation had just stopped being a misunderstanding. It had become something much more dangerous. No one in the boardroom spoke. Jason remained standing beside the conference table, staring at the screen as if another explanation might suddenly appear. It didn't. The silence itself became evidence. Harrison Cole slowly folded his glasses and placed them on the table. Mr. Mercer, he said calmly, you've spent the last 5 minutes telling this board everything is being misunderstood. I'm giving you one final opportunity. Explain where Apex's money went. Jason took a slow breath before forcing another smile. With all due respect, Chairman Cole, Miss Caldwell is creating a story by connecting unrelated documents. One mailbox doesn't prove fraud. I nodded slightly. You're right. I reached into the folder again. One mailbox proves nothing. I removed another document. But patterns do. I projected a timeline across the giant screen. Unlike the earlier financial charts, this one was simple. It contained only dates, photographs, and signatures. The first image showed Jason approving a consulting contract. The second showed the payment leaving Apex 3 days later. The third showed the money arriving at another company. The fourth showed that company sending nearly the same amount into an investment account controlled by Brandon Caldwell Holdings. No complicated accounting terms. Just 4 simple steps connected by red arrows. One director leaned forward. How many times did this happen? I looked at him. One transaction can be an accident. I pressed the remote once. The number 12 appeared. 12 can be a coincidence. Another click. 31. 31 becomes a pattern. The final click filled the screen with one number, 147. A wave of whispers moved around the table. 147 separate transfers followed exactly the same path. Jason immediately shook his head. Those are legitimate business expenses. Then let's test that, I replied. I opened a sealed evidence envelope and removed a stack of signed approval forms. Every payment required 2 executive approvals. I placed Jason's signature beside Brandon's. Every single time. Brandon finally stood up. You're twisting routine paperwork. I looked directly at him. Am I? I pressed another button. The screen changed again, this time showing security footage from Apex's executive office late one Friday night. The timestamp was visible in the corner. Jason walked into the finance department carrying a folder. 5 minutes later, Brandon entered. 15 minutes after that, they both left carrying the same folder. Harrison frowned. What night was this? The night before the largest consulting payment in company history, I answered. $8.6 million. Jason's confidence was gone now. He loosened his tie again and glanced toward the exit for only a second. Harrison noticed immediately. Sit down, Mr. Mercer. Jason slowly lowered himself back into his chair. I continued without raising my voice. I didn't begin this investigation believing Jason was stealing from Apex. I paused. I actually believed someone was stealing from him. Several directors looked surprised, but every document led back to the same names. I turned another page. Jason Mercer. Another page. Brandon Caldwell. Another. Monica Ellis. I closed the folder. No matter where I started, I always ended with the 3 of you. The room fell silent again. Then one independent director quietly asked the question everyone else was thinking. Miss Caldwell, how much money are we really talking about? I looked around the table before answering. Not 9 million. I shook my head. Not 20 million. I pressed the final key on the remote. One enormous number appeared across the screen. $48,732,416. Nobody moved. Nobody even whispered. Harrison slowly stood, staring at the number for several long seconds before asking only one question. Can you prove every dollar? I reached into my briefcase and placed 3 encrypted drives on the conference table. Every bank transfer, another drive. Every approval, another. Every email. Finally, I placed a signed forensic report in front of Harrison. Every dollar is documented. Jason suddenly slammed his hand against the table. This is insane, he shouted. She's been planning this for years. I looked at him calmly. You're right. The room became completely still. I have been working on this for 14 months. I stepped closer. You've been stealing from Apex for nearly 3 years. Before Jason could respond, his company phone vibrated loudly on the table. The screen lit up where everyone could see it. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Financial Crimes Division. No one touched the phone. It rang once, then again, then a third time. Jason stared at the screen but never reached for it. Harrison quietly looked at the directors. I believe this meeting is over. He turned toward the chief compliance officer. Escort Mr. Mercer and Mr. Caldwell to separate conference rooms. Effective immediately. Neither of them is permitted to contact any employee, access any company system, or leave this building without legal authorization. As security officers stepped forward, Jason looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a man who had just realized his greatest mistake wasn't stealing $48 million. His greatest mistake was believing I would never come back. The phone kept ringing on the conference table, and for the first time since I had known Jason Mercer, he looked afraid of a screen. He did not answer it. He simply stared at the words, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division, as if silence could make them disappear. Harrison Cole waited until the call ended, then turned toward the compliance officer. Separate rooms, he said. Now. 2 security officers stepped toward Jason. Another 2 moved toward Brandon. Brandon immediately lifted both hands as if he had been personally insulted. You cannot treat me like a criminal in front of the board. Harrison's face did not change. Then perhaps you should not have behaved like one. A few directors looked down at their notes to hide their reactions. Jason tried to stand with dignity, but the moment he pushed his chair back, his knee struck the conference table. The small, clumsy sound destroyed what remained of his executive image. Monica, who had slipped into the doorway during the final minutes of the presentation, looked from Jason to Brandon with growing panic. She had entered expecting to perform another scene, maybe cry, maybe accuse me of harassment, maybe remind everyone that she was the senator's daughter and therefore untouchable. But the FBI's name had changed the temperature of the room. Wealth could intimidate employees. Social status could frighten gossip columns, but federal investigators did not care how expensive your gown was. "This is a mistake," Monica whispered. I turned toward her. "Which part?" She swallowed. "All of it." I picked up one of the folders and opened it slowly. "Then you should have no problem explaining why a public relations firm you secretly control received $3.4 million from Apex for a media campaign that never ran." Her face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You will," Harrison said coldly. "In a separate room." Monica looked at Jason, expecting him to defend her. He looked away. That tiny betrayal said more than any confession could. Jason had used Monica when she was useful, and now that the walls were closing in, he was already deciding which person to sacrifice first. Brandon noticed it too. "Don't say anything," he warned Monica. Harrison raised one eyebrow. Interesting advice from an innocent man. Security escorted Jason down one hallway, Brandon down another, and Monica into a smaller executive conference room near legal. When the doors closed behind them, the boardroom exhaled as if everyone had been holding the same breath. One director finally spoke. "Miss Caldwell, how exposed is this company?" I looked at the screen where the $48 million figure still glowed. "Financially? Significant." I paused. "Legally? Recoverable if we cooperate fully." Harrison nodded. "And reputationally?" I thought of the hundreds of employees downstairs drinking champagne beneath banners celebrating Apex's integrity. "That depends on whether the public sees Apex as the victim of fraud, or the company that tried to hide it." Harrison studied me for several seconds, then smiled faintly. "That is why you're sitting in that chair." Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. I looked down. "Mom." I almost ignored it. Then I remembered the necklace around Monica's neck. I remembered my mother telling me Grandma's pendant was gone. I remembered her attending Jason and Monica's engagement dinner and posting pictures as if she had gained a better daughter. I answered, "Hello?" My mother's voice came through sharp and controlled. "Bethany, what have you done? Not are you okay? Not what is happening. Not why is your brother being escorted out of a boardroom. Just accusation." "I'm doing my job," I said. "Your job?" she snapped. "Your brother just called your father. He said you humiliated him in front of the entire board." I looked toward the hallway where Brandon had disappeared. "He committed fraud in front of the entire company. Do not use that tone with me." Her voice dropped lower. "Family matters are handled privately." I almost laughed. "You mean like giving Grandma's necklace to Monica privately?" Silence. For 3 seconds I heard nothing but the faint sound of my own breathing. Then my mother said, "That necklace was wasted sitting in a box." The words struck harder than I expected. I had been calm in front of Jason, calm in front of Monica, calm in front of the board. But hearing my mother reduce my grandmother's promise to something that had been wasted on me made my throat tighten. I turned slightly away from the directors so no one would see my face. "Grandma wanted me to have it." "Your grandmother was sentimental," my mother replied. "Monica understands presentation. She understands how to stand beside successful men. You never did." I closed my eyes for 1 second. That was the real wound. Not Jason, not Monica, not even Brandon. My own mother had watched me lose everything and decided the problem was that I didn't lose gracefully enough. Harrison's voice was gentle behind me. "Miss Caldwell?" I opened my eyes. "I'm fine," my mother continued. "Your father and I expect you home immediately. Brandon needs you to stop this before it goes too far." It already went too far, I said quietly. 3 years ago. Don't be dramatic. Her tone became softer, which somehow made it worse. Bethany, sweetheart, we know you're hurt. Jason embarrassed you. Monica hurt your feelings. But destroying your brother's career will not heal you. There it was, the performance. The fake tenderness she used whenever cruelty needed to sound respectable. This isn't about hurt feelings, I said. $48 million is not a breakup. Your brother is family. So am I. She did not answer. That silence told me everything. A moment later, my father's voice entered the call. He must have taken the phone from her. Come home now. No greeting. No warmth. Just command. I'm in the middle of a board investigation. You are in the middle of embarrassing this family, he said. Brandon has done more for us than you ever will. Whatever mistake he made can be fixed quietly. I looked through the glass wall toward the executive hallway. Behind one closed door sat the brother my parents had spent a lifetime protecting. Behind another sat the man who had betrayed me. In the ballroom below, Monica was still wearing the last thing my grandmother ever wanted me to have. What exactly do you want me to do? I asked. My father answered without hesitation. Shut the investigation down. Resign from whatever temporary position they gave you, and come home. We will discuss how you can apologize to your brother. For a moment, I could not speak. Not because I was shocked, because I finally understood that no evidence would ever be enough for them. They could watch Brandon steal from a company, destroy our parents' finances, and help Jason ruin my life, and they would still call him the victim if I refused to stay quiet. No, I said. The word was small, but it changed something inside me. My father's voice hardened. Excuse me? No. I said it again, stronger this time. I'm not resigning. I'm not apologizing. And I'm not protecting Brandon. My father became very quiet. Then he said, Then you leave us no choice. The call ended. I stared at the dark screen for several seconds. Harrison stepped beside me. They threatened you? Not directly. I placed the phone on the table. But they will. As if the universe wanted to prove me right, Brandon's conference room door opened at the far end of the hallway. He stepped out with an apex attorney behind him, his face flushed with anger. This is over, he shouted. Mom and Dad are waiting. You're coming home. Every director turned. Harrison stood. Mr. Caldwell, you were instructed to remain in the conference room. Brandon ignored him completely and pointed at me. You think you're powerful because some old billionaire gave you a title for one night? His voice cracked with rage. You are still the same jealous little sister who couldn't keep her fiancé, couldn't keep her place in this family, and couldn't accept that I was always the one meant to lead. Something in the room shifted. It wasn't just the insult. It was the entitlement behind it. The board members were finally seeing what I had lived with my entire life. Brandon stepped closer. You want to talk about family trust records? He snapped. Fine. Let's talk about how Mom and Dad spent your college fund, because I had real potential. Let's talk about how every sacrifice this family made for me was worth it because I was the one who could actually carry the Caldwell name. My chest tightened, but I did not look away. You stole from them too. He laughed bitterly. They gave it willingly because they knew I mattered more. The room went still. Even Jason, visible through the glass in the next conference room, looked up. Brandon realized too late that he had said the quiet part aloud. I slowly opened the folder labeled Caldwell Family Trust Records and placed it on the table. Thank you, I said. That was the first honest thing you've said all night. Brandon's face changed. Bethany. No, I said. You wanted to talk about family, so now we will. I opened the folder, and the first page showed a loan against my parents' retirement home, signed 6 months earlier and guaranteed by Brandon Caldwell. The second showed that the money had never gone to Apex. The third showed it moving into the same hidden accounts Jason had been using. My father thought he was calling me home to save Brandon. What he didn't know was that Brandon had already sold him out too. And by the time I reached my parents' house, I would not be walking into their trap unprepared. I would be bringing the truth with me. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, every light inside the house was on. From the outside, it looked exactly the same as it had my entire childhood. The same white columns, the same perfectly trimmed hedges, the same expensive front door my father loved because it made visitors believe the people inside were successful and respectable. To everyone else, it was a beautiful family home. To me, it had become the place where the truth was always rewritten to protect the wrong person. I sat in my car for a moment without getting out. Harrison had warned me that desperate people became unpredictable. Jason's whisper echoed in my mind. Make sure she signs tonight. Whatever waited inside that house had already been planned before my parents ever called. I picked up my phone and quietly sent one text message to Harrison. If you don't hear from me in 2 hours, open the emergency file. His reply came almost instantly. Understood. Stay calm. Trust your instincts. I slipped my phone into my purse, activated the voice recorder I had hidden inside the lining weeks earlier, and walked toward the front door. Before I could knock, it opened. My mother stood there wearing the same gentle smile she used whenever she wanted strangers to believe she was the perfect mother. There you are, she said softly, reaching for my hand as though nothing had happened that afternoon. Come inside. Your father isn't feeling well. For a brief moment, I almost believed her. Then I noticed she never asked whether I was all right. She never mentioned the investigation. She never asked why federal agents had contacted Apex. Her only concern was getting me through the front door. My father was sitting in the living room with a blanket across his knees and one hand resting dramatically against his chest. Brandon sat beside him while Jason stood near the fireplace. Monica was there too, wearing my grandmother's necklace as if she belonged in the family more than I ever had. My father looked up and gave a weak smile. Thank you for coming. I remained standing. You said this was an emergency. It is, my mother answered. Our family is falling apart. Jason lowered his eyes, pretending to look ashamed. Brandon sighed heavily, as though he were carrying the burden of everyone else's mistakes. The performance would have been convincing if I hadn't spent my entire life watching them rehearse it. My father slowly pushed himself to his feet. Sit down, Bethany. I stayed where I was. I'd rather stand. His expression hardened for a split second before the smile returned. We're all emotional today. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. My mother placed a folder on the coffee table. We spoke with our attorney. She gently slid it toward me. If you sign these documents tonight, everything can still be fixed. I didn't touch the folder. What documents? Brandon answered before anyone else could. A resignation letter from Apex, a confidentiality agreement, and a statement confirming today's accusations were based on a misunderstanding. Jason finally spoke. No one wants this investigation to continue. Investors will panic. Employees could lose their jobs. I almost laughed. The man who had stolen millions of dollars was suddenly worried about employees. And if I don't sign? I asked quietly. The room became silent. My father slowly removed his glasses and looked directly into my eyes. Then this family will have no choice but to protect itself. My mother took a deep breath. Bethany, we've already spoken with doctors. My stomach tightened. What doctors? She opened another folder. 3 years ago, after Jason left you, you suffered severe emotional distress. Brandon added, you stopped eating. You isolated yourself. You disappeared for months. We were worried about you. My mother continued. So we documented everything. Jason looked at me with fake sympathy. Sometimes people don't realize how unstable they've become. My father pushed a second folder toward me. Across the top were the words, Psychological Capacity Evaluation. I opened the first page. My name was printed across it. The report claimed I suffered from severe emotional instability, impaired judgment, obsessive behavior, and paranoia. It recommended that any major financial or corporate decisions made by me should be reviewed by a legal guardian. I slowly looked up. This report is fake. My father didn't blink. It's signed by a licensed psychiatrist who has never met me. That doesn't matter once it's filed. My mother leaned closer. Bethany, if you continue attacking Brandon, we'll have no choice but to submit these records. Once the court questions your mental capacity, everything you've told the board will become unreliable. Brandon smiled for the first time that evening. No company keeps an unstable CEO. Jason folded his arms. The board won't risk letting someone declared mentally incompetent lead a $1 billion corporation. I quietly closed the file. My heartbeat remained steady. Everything Harrison predicted was happening exactly as expected. They weren't trying to convince me, they were trying to frighten me. My father slid a silver pen across the table. Sign the resignation. My mother pushed the second document beside it. Sign the confidentiality agreement. Brandon added the final sentence. Then we all walk away. I looked around the room one last time. 4 people. 4 familiar faces. 4 people who believed I was completely alone. Slowly, I picked up the pen. Relief immediately spread across Jason's face. My mother smiled. Brandon leaned back confidently. They all believed I had finally broken. None of them noticed the tiny red light blinking inside my handbag, recording every word that had just been spoken. And none of them realized the real reason I picked up the pen was not to surrender. It was to let every one of them finish committing the biggest mistake of their lives. The moment I wrapped my fingers around the pen, every face in the room relaxed. Jason finally leaned back against the fireplace. Brandon crossed his arms with a smug smile, and my mother quietly exhaled as though the nightmare she feared had finally come to an end. My father even poured himself a glass of whiskey, apparently recovering from the chest pain that had almost killed him less than 30 minutes earlier. Watching that performance disappear so quickly told me everything I needed to know. There had never been a medical emergency. There had only been a carefully planned ambush. I lowered my eyes to the resignation letter and slowly turned the pages as if I were reading every line. No one interrupted me. They thought they had won. That was exactly what I wanted them to believe. After several long moments, I looked up at my father. Before I sign anything, I have one question. He nodded confidently. Go ahead. If I sign these papers, Brandon keeps his position? Yes. Jason walks away? Yes. No investigation? Correct. I looked toward my mother. And all of you expect me to pretend none of this ever happened? She reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. Families forgive each other, Bethany. I slowly pulled my hand away. Families also tell the truth. The smile disappeared from her face. Brandon rolled his eyes. Here we go again. I ignored him and reached into my purse. Jason immediately stiffened. For one brief second, I saw genuine fear flash across his face. I wasn't reaching for a weapon. I was reaching for my phone. I unlocked it and pressed play on a recording. Brandon's voice immediately filled the room. Make sure she signs tonight. The room froze. Jason's eyes widened. Brandon turned pale. I let the recording continue. Their conversation outside the boardroom played through the speakers. Jason calmly explaining that once I resigned, the board would lose its only witness. Brandon promising our parents would pressure me into signing. Jason laughing as he said, She still thinks they love her more than they love us. No one moved. My mother slowly looked toward Brandon. What is this? Brandon opened his mouth but couldn't answer. I stopped the recording before the conversation ended and quietly placed the phone back on the table. That recording was made before I arrived here tonight. I looked directly at Jason. You planned this before my father ever called. Jason quickly recovered. It's edited. I smiled. Really? I connected my phone to the television mounted above the fireplace. A security video from Apex appeared on the screen. The timestamp matched the exact moment Jason and Brandon left the boardroom together. The camera had no audio, but the recording on my phone matched their movements perfectly. Every word lined up with every step. My father looked from the television to Brandon. Tell me that's not true. Brandon avoided his eyes. Dad, tell me. My father shouted loud enough to shake the room. Brandon finally snapped. Fine! He threw both hands into the air. Yes, we planned it! Complete silence followed. My mother stared at her son in disbelief. Brandon pointed directly at me. She was destroying everything. We had to stop her before she handed the company to federal investigators. My father looked completely lost. You said Bethany was attacking you because she was jealous. Brandon laughed bitterly. Would you have listened if I told you the truth? Nobody answered. He looked around the room before continuing. I've spent my entire life carrying this family. Every investment you ever made was because of me. Every connection you ever had came through me. I built everything. I quietly opened another folder from my purse. No, I said. You borrowed everything. I placed several bank statements on the coffee table. This is your personal account. Another stack followed. This is Mom and Dad's retirement account. Then another. This is the Caldwell Family Trust. Finally, I laid one last document in front of my father. This is the transfer authorization carrying Brandon's signature. My father slowly picked it up. The amount was impossible to ignore. Nearly every dollar he and my mother had saved for retirement had been transferred into one of Brandon's private investment companies less than 8 months earlier. His hands began to shake. Brandon. His voice barely rose above a whisper. You told us this money was buying government bonds. Brandon looked away. The investment failed. No, I answered quietly. It never became an investment. I turned another page. The transfer continued through one of the same companies Jason had been using inside Apex. The room fell silent again. My mother looked at Brandon with tears filling her eyes. You used our retirement? Brandon still refused to meet her eyes. Jason immediately stepped forward. Don't blame Brandon. It was my idea. I looked at him. He wasn't protecting Brandon. He was trying to control the story before Brandon completely collapsed, but it was already too late. For the first time that evening, my parents weren't looking at me as the problem. They were looking at the son they had defended my entire life. And for the first time in years, Brandon realized the lie that had always protected him was beginning to fall apart. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. My father remained frozen on the sofa, staring at the bank statements scattered across the coffee table as though they belonged to another family. My mother silently wiped tears from her face, but she still couldn't bring herself to look at me. She kept staring at Brandon, searching for the little boy she had spent her entire life protecting. He was gone. In his place stood a desperate man whose lies had finally caught up with him. Brandon slowly sat down and buried his face in his hands. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he whispered. My father looked at him with disbelief. Then how was it supposed to happen? Brandon didn't answer. Jason stepped forward instead. Mr. Caldwell, this isn't Brandon's fault. I turned toward him. Even now, he was trying to take control of the room. No? Jason shook his head. The company was struggling after the market downturn. We needed temporary financing. Brandon believed the money would be returned before anyone noticed. My father stood up so quickly that his whiskey glass crashed onto the hardwood floor. You used our retirement without asking us? Jason remained calm. It was an investment. You lied to us, my father shouted. Every successful investment involves risk. You forged my signature. My father's voice echoed through the entire house. Jason didn't deny it. He simply lowered his eyes for a moment before saying, I did what I believed was necessary. Those words sounded painfully familiar. I had heard them from Jason before. Every lie, every betrayal, every manipulation had always been justified as something necessary. He never admitted wrongdoing because, in his mind, success excused everything. My mother slowly turned toward him. Did you convince Brandon to do this? Jason hesitated for the first time all evening. That hesitation answered the question before he ever opened his mouth. Brandon finally looked up. Mom. She held up her hand, stopping him. No. Tears rolled down her face. I want him to answer. Jason took a deep breath. Brandon came to me because he wanted to prove he deserved to become CEO someday. He wanted investors to see bigger profits. He believed one successful year would change everything. Brandon immediately interrupted. You said there was no risk. Jason looked at him coldly. There wasn't supposed to be. My father stared at both of them in disbelief. So both of you stole from this family? Jason corrected him without emotion. We borrowed from the family. I couldn't help shaking my head. That's the problem, Jason. Every eye turned toward me. You still think changing one word changes the truth. Jason ignored me. He turned back toward my parents. We can still fix this. My father laughed bitterly. Fix it? Jason nodded. If Bethany withdraws the investigation, the board will settle internally. The FBI won't become involved. We recover the company, restore the investments over time, and no one has to know. My mother slowly looked toward me. For the first time that night, there was no anger in her face, only fear. Bethany, she whispered, could that happen? I looked at her quietly. No. The room fell silent again. Once federal investigators request financial records, no company can simply pretend nothing happened. Jason immediately stepped closer. That's not entirely true. It is, I replied, because I already sent every document to an independent escrow service this afternoon. Jason's face changed instantly. What? If anything happens to me. I calmly reached into my purse and placed another envelope on the coffee table. Or if anyone attempts to pressure me into withdrawing the investigation, every document is automatically delivered to federal investigators, the Securities and Exchange Commission, Apex's insurance carriers, and every member of the board. Brandon stared at me. You planned that? The moment you asked Dad to fake a medical emergency. Jason took one step toward me. Cancel it. I smiled faintly. I can't. You can. No, I repeated. The process is automatic. Jason's calm expression finally cracked. Do you understand what you've done? Yes. You've destroyed all of us. I looked directly into his eyes. No, Jason. I paused long enough for every word to sink in. I only stopped protecting the people who destroyed themselves. Before Jason could respond, his own phone rang again. This time he answered immediately. He didn't even bother leaving the room. Hello? His confident expression disappeared within seconds. No, he whispered. How? He listened for another few moments before slowly lowering the phone. Brandon immediately stood. What happened? Jason looked around the room like a man watching his future collapse. Federal agents. He swallowed hard. Are executing search warrants at Apex headquarters. My father slowly sat back down. My mother covered her mouth. Brandon staggered backward until he hit the wall behind him. Jason closed his eyes for a brief moment before looking directly at me. For the first time since I had ever known him, there was no arrogance left in his voice. Only desperation. Bethany, he said quietly. What else do you know? I didn't answer, because Jason had finally started asking the wrong question. He still believed this investigation was about stolen money. He had no idea the most devastating secret I had uncovered wasn't hidden inside Apex's financial records. It was hidden inside my own family's past, and once that truth came out, none of them would ever be able to look at each other the same way again. Jason never answered my question. Instead, he grabbed his suit jacket and rushed toward the front door. Brandon immediately followed him, nearly knocking over a chair in his panic. My father instinctively called after them. Where are you going? Jason stopped with one hand on the doorknob. To save what's left. Then both men disappeared into the night. The front door slammed so hard the family photographs hanging in the hallway shook against the wall. My mother slowly collapsed onto the sofa, staring blankly at the scattered documents covering the coffee table. The silence inside the house felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. For the first time in years, no one was blaming me. No one was calling me jealous. No one was telling me to forgive and forget. They were finally forced to look at the damage with no one left to hide behind. My father lowered his head into his hands. Tell me the truth, he whispered without looking at me. How bad is this? I sat across from him and answered honestly. If Jason destroyed evidence after the search warrants were issued, the charges become much more serious. My mother looked up, her face pale. Destroyed evidence? I nodded. Jason knows investigators are coming. If he believes there's still something inside Apex that can save him, he'll try to erase it before they reach it. My father slowly looked toward the front door. Brandon went with him. Yes, then he'll help him. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. My parents finally understood what I had been trying to tell them all evening. Their son wasn't being manipulated anymore. He was making his own choices. My phone suddenly vibrated. Harrison Cole's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. Bethany. His voice remained calm, but I could hear controlled urgency beneath it. Our security team just reported that Jason and Brandon entered the executive building through the underground garage. My heart sank. The building is under preservation order. Exactly, Harrison replied. They no longer have access badges, but someone inside let them in. I stood instantly. Which floor? The executive server level. Every instinct inside me told me exactly what Jason was trying to do. He wasn't going after money. He was going after data. Thousands of financial records, internal emails, security logs, and backup files were stored in secure servers beneath Apex headquarters. If those servers disappeared before federal agents completed their seizure, proving the full conspiracy would become much harder. Harrison spoke again. Police are on their way, but they're still several minutes out. I was already picking up my car keys. I'm closer. Bethany. Harrison hesitated. Don't do anything reckless. I'm not going there to stop them. I looked toward the evidence folders still lying across my parents' coffee table. I'm going there to make sure they stop themselves. My father stood. You're leaving? I nodded. Jason is desperate. My mother slowly rose from the sofa. Don't go. It was the first time all evening she had sounded genuinely frightened. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. 3 years ago, none of you came when I needed someone. I opened the front door. Tonight, innocent employees still deserve someone to protect what's left. Neither of them tried to stop me. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the underground parking garage beneath Apex Tower. Police cars had not arrived yet, but the building's emergency lights were already flashing. I hurried toward the private elevator and used my executive access card. The elevator climbed quickly toward the restricted server level. As the doors opened, I immediately heard shouting echoing through the hallway. Jason and Brandon stood outside the reinforced server room arguing with Apex's night security supervisor. Open the door, Jason shouted. I still have executive authority. The supervisor shook his head. Your credentials were revoked. Brandon stepped forward aggressively. Move. The supervisor refused. I have written orders from Chairman Cole. I stayed hidden around the corner for a moment, watching everything unfold. Jason suddenly looked around the hallway before grabbing a red emergency fire axe mounted inside a glass cabinet. Brandon stared at him in shock. What are you doing? Jason smashed the glass without hesitation. The alarm immediately began screaming throughout the building. He pulled the axe free and looked directly at the steel security door protecting the server room. If I can't open it, he said through clenched teeth, I'll break it. Brandon hesitated only a second before helping him drag a heavy maintenance cart toward the entrance. I quietly took out my phone and started recording. I didn't shout. I didn't step forward. I simply watched as the two men who had spent years pretending to be respected executives began destroying their own future with their own hands. Jason raised the axe high above his head and brought it crashing down against the electronic lock. Sparks exploded across the hallway. The security supervisor immediately stepped back and shouted into his radio, Officer needs assistance. Executive level. Suspects attempting to destroy secured evidence. Jason ignored him and struck the door again. Then again. Then again. Every swing echoed through the empty hallway. Every strike was captured by the building's security cameras. Every second made their legal situation worse. Brandon finally looked over his shoulder and saw me standing quietly at the end of the corridor. His face drained of color. Jason, he whispered. Jason turned. The moment our eyes met, he understood exactly why I wasn't trying to stop him. Because I didn't need to. He had just committed another crime in front of multiple witnesses, dozens of cameras, and the woman he had underestimated from the very beginning. In the distance, I heard the unmistakable sound of police sirens racing toward Apex Tower, and for the first time that night, Jason realized there was no longer any way to erase what he had done. The sound of police sirens grew louder with every passing second, echoing through the underground levels of Apex Tower. Jason stood frozen, still gripping the fire axe, while Brandon looked from me to the damaged security door, finally realizing there was no explanation that could erase what dozens of surveillance cameras had just recorded. The night security supervisor never took his eyes off them. "Drop the axe," he ordered. Jason ignored him. Instead, he stared directly at me. "You planned this." I calmly slipped my phone back into my purse. "No, Jason." I shook my head. "You planned this. I simply chose not to stop you." His jaw tightened. "You wanted me to panic. I knew you would." The elevator doors opened again, and 6 uniformed police officers rushed onto the executive floor, followed closely by 2 federal agents wearing dark jackets with large yellow letters across their backs. The lead officer immediately assessed the scene: the shattered emergency cabinet, the damaged electronic lock, the axe in Jason's hands. The security supervisor pointing toward the destroyed entrance. "Sir," the officer shouted, "put the axe on the floor." Jason slowly lowered it but didn't let go. Brandon whispered urgently, "Do it." Jason finally released the handle. The heavy axe struck the marble floor with a metallic crash that echoed through the hallway. One of the federal agents walked directly to the damaged server room door before turning toward the officers. "This area has already been placed under federal evidence preservation." He looked back at Jason. "Who damaged the entrance?" Before anyone could answer, Jason pointed directly at me. "She did." Every head turned toward me. I didn't move. Brandon stared at Jason in disbelief. Even he hadn't expected Jason to lie so quickly. The federal agent looked from Jason to the shattered glass cabinet. "You witnessed her do it?" Jason nodded without hesitation. "She grabbed the axe after threatening us." Brandon looked at Jason, completely stunned. "Jason." Jason ignored him. "She attacked the security system before we could stop her." I quietly smiled. The agent noticed. "Something funny?" I reached into my purse and removed my phone. "Actually, yes." I turned the screen toward him. "I've been recording since I stepped off the elevator." The agent accepted the phone and pressed play. The video began with Jason smashing the emergency cabinet, pulling out the axe, and striking the electronic lock over and over while Brandon stood beside him. Every word, every movement, every blow was captured in perfect detail. The hallway became silent again. The officer slowly looked back at Jason. "Would you like to change your statement?" Jason's face turned pale. "That video is edited." Before I could respond, the security supervisor spoke. "Our hallway cameras recorded the exact same thing." Another officer lifted his radio. "Control. Preserve all surveillance footage from executive level immediately." The federal agent handed my phone back to me before turning toward Jason. "Mr. Mercer, at this point you're looking at obstruction of a federal investigation, destruction of protected evidence, and making a false statement to law enforcement." Jason suddenly pointed toward Brandon. "It was his idea." Brandon's eyes widened. "What?" "You told me to break the door," Jason shouted. Brandon stepped backward in disbelief. "You're insane." Jason laughed bitterly. "You're the one who pushed me into this." For several seconds, the 2 men screamed over each other, each blaming the other for every decision they had made over the last 3 years. The officers didn't interrupt. They simply listened while both suspects destroyed the last remaining loyalty between them. One federal agent quietly leaned toward me. "Do they always do this?" I answered honestly. "Only when they realize they're losing." Suddenly, Monica ran out of the executive elevator, completely out of breath. She looked from Jason to the police officers before rushing toward them. "Stop!" she shouted. "You're arresting the wrong people." Jason looked relieved for less than a second. Monica grabbed his arm dramatically. "Bethany manipulated all of us." She pointed directly at me. "She's been obsessed with Jason ever since he left her. She planned everything because she wanted revenge." The officers looked at one another without reacting. Monica continued speaking faster and faster. "She staged this whole scene. She tricked Jason. She threatened Brandon. She's mentally unstable." The words hung in the hallway. I slowly turned toward the federal agent. "Would you like to hear something interesting?" He nodded. I opened another folder from my briefcase. "About an hour ago, I placed several documents into his hands. They tried forcing me to sign my resignation by threatening to file a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, declaring me mentally incompetent. Monica's confident expression disappeared. The federal agent flipped through the report. Who prepared this? I looked directly at Monica. Ask the people who were trying to use it tonight. For the first time since arriving at Apex Tower, Monica had nothing to say. Her silence lasted only a few seconds before the lead detective's phone rang. He listened carefully, thanked the caller, then looked directly at Jason, Brandon, and Monica. We've just received confirmation from headquarters. He paused. Search teams have completed the initial review of your executive offices. Jason swallowed hard. And? The detective slowly closed his notebook. They found something none of you expected. Jason's face lost what little color remained, because whatever investigators had discovered upstairs, it was serious enough to change the entire direction of the case. The sound of the handcuffs closing around Jason's wrists echoed through the executive hallway like the final note of a long-forgotten promise. For the first time since I had met him, he looked completely powerless. The man who had once convinced investors, board members, reporters, and even my own family that he was destined to become Apex Innovation's next CEO, now stood surrounded by police officers with his hands locked behind his back. No expensive suit could hide the fear in his eyes anymore. No carefully rehearsed speech could explain away the evidence stacked inside clear plastic evidence bags only a few feet away. Brandon stood frozen, staring at Jason as though his entire world had collapsed in front of him. Monica slowly backed away until she reached the wall, her face completely drained of color. Harrison Cole remained silent, allowing everyone to absorb the reality of what had just happened. The detective stepped forward, holding one of the recovered hard drives. "Mr. Mercer," he said calmly, "our forensic team has already confirmed these drives contain complete backups of financial records, deleted executive emails, contract revisions, and overseas banking instructions. Hiding them instead of destroying them may have been the biggest mistake you ever made." Jason gave a tired smile. "You think you've already won?" Harrison finally spoke. "No." He looked directly at Jason. "We think you've finally stopped lying." Jason lowered his head for a brief moment before lifting it again. "You still don't understand everything." I watched him carefully. There was something different in his voice. He wasn't trying to save himself anymore. He was trying to protect someone else. I quietly stepped closer. "Who are you still protecting, Jason?" He looked straight into my eyes but refused to answer. The silence lasted only a few seconds before Brandon suddenly spoke. "Don't tell them anything." Jason turned toward him with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't loyalty. It was disappointment. "It's too late." Brandon shook his head violently. "No, it isn't. They don't know everything yet." The detective immediately looked toward Brandon. "Everything about what?" Brandon realized too late that he had spoken without thinking. He quickly looked away, but the damage had already been done. Harrison folded his arms. "Interesting." He slowly turned toward the detective. "I believe we should continue this conversation downtown." Before anyone moved, another officer hurried down the hallway carrying a sealed evidence box recovered from the executive parking garage. "Sir," he called, "our vehicle search is complete." The detective opened the box in front of everyone. Inside were stacks of unsigned stock transfer certificates, wire authorization forms, encrypted flash drives, and 3 passports carrying Jason's photograph under different names. Brandon stared at the passports in complete disbelief. "You were leaving?" Jason didn't answer. Brandon stepped closer, despite the officers surrounding him. "You promised we'd fix this together." Jason finally looked at him. "I promised I'd try." "You were going to leave me here." Jason remained silent. That silence hurt Brandon more than any confession ever could. My father had spent his entire life telling me Brandon would always protect this family. Yet the man Brandon trusted most had already prepared 3 fake identities and an escape plan without him. Harrison looked toward Jason. "Planning an extended vacation?" Jason smiled bitterly but said nothing. The detective carefully sealed the evidence box before speaking again. "Mister?" Mercer, based on the evidence recovered tonight, you're under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and preparation to flee federal jurisdiction. Jason nodded slowly, as though he had expected those words all along. As two officers began leading him toward the elevator, he suddenly stopped and turned back toward me. You spent 3 years building this case. I shook my head. No. I held his eyes without anger. I spent 3 years rebuilding the life you tried to take from me. The elevator doors opened behind him. Just before stepping inside, Jason looked at me one final time. It's not over, Bethany, I answered quietly. No. Then I looked toward Brandon, whose face had become almost as pale as Jason's, because this investigation stopped being about stolen money a long time ago. Harrison turned toward me with curiosity. What do you mean? I looked down at the sealed folder still resting inside my briefcase. The one folder I had deliberately kept hidden from everyone, including the board. The financial fraud was only the beginning, I said softly. The biggest lie my family ever told wasn't inside Apex. Brandon's eyes widened. My father and my mother. He have been hiding something for more than 20 years. Brandon took one frightened step backward. Bethany. His voice cracked for the first time all night. Don't. I looked directly at him. You knew, didn't you? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The fear on his face told me everything I needed to know. Whatever secret my parents had buried all those years ago. Brandon had known the truth all along. And once it came to light, $48 million would no longer be the story that destroyed the Caldwell family. It would only be the beginning. The hallway fell completely silent after my last words. Even the officers escorting Jason paused for a moment, sensing that whatever I was about to reveal carried far more weight than the fraud investigation surrounding us. Harrison studied my face carefully. Bethany, he said quietly, if there's something else, now is the time. I nodded but didn't answer immediately. Instead, I opened the leather briefcase I had carried with me all night and removed a weathered brown envelope. Unlike every financial report, forensic audit, and bank record I had presented before, this envelope looked old. The corners were worn. The seal had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 4 words. To Bethany, when you're ready. Harrison frowned. What is that? I ran my fingers gently across the envelope before answering. My grandmother gave this to her attorney 22 years ago. Brandon's face immediately turned pale. He knew exactly what I was holding. Don't open it, he whispered. Nobody had asked him anything, yet he was already pleading. That alone caught everyone's attention. Harrison slowly turned toward him. You've seen it before? Brandon didn't answer. His silence was louder than any confession. I carefully opened the envelope and removed a handwritten letter along with several legal documents. The handwriting belonged to my grandmother. I recognized it instantly. I hadn't seen it since I was a little girl writing birthday cards beside her kitchen table. My hands trembled slightly as I began reading aloud. If you are reading this, Bethany, it means the truth has finally become more important than keeping peace inside this family. My mother's voice suddenly echoed from the far end of the hallway. Bethany, stop. Everyone turned. She and my father had just arrived, escorted into Apex Tower after learning Jason had been arrested. My mother looked terrified, not angry, terrified. Please, she whispered. Don't read it. Harrison looked between us. Mrs. Caldwell, do you know what's in that letter? Tears immediately filled her eyes. She couldn't answer. I continued reading. For years I watched my son and daughter-in-law love one child more than the other. They believed they were hiding it. They weren't. Every birthday, every holiday, every sacrifice was made for Brandon while Bethany was expected to understand, forgive, and remain silent. My father slowly lowered his head. No one in the hallway moved. Even the officers remained still. I continued. I confronted them many times. They promised they would change. They never did. My voice grew quieter. If they still haven't changed by the time you read this, then they never will. My mother began crying openly. "Please," she whispered again. "Enough." I looked at her for several long seconds before unfolding the final page. Attached behind it was a certified copy of my grandmother's will. Harrison carefully accepted it and adjusted his glasses. His expression changed almost immediately. "This," he murmured, "this was never filed with probate." My father suddenly closed his eyes. He already knew why. Harrison continued reading. The diamond pendant, the lake house, the investment portfolio, and the family trust. He looked directly at my parents. Every one of these assets was legally left to Bethany. Complete silence. I slowly turned toward Monica, who was still wearing my grandmother's pendant around her neck. She instinctively touched it as though realizing for the first time it had never belonged to her. Harrison's voice became colder. Instead, the probate records show every one of these assets was transferred to Brandon through an amended estate filing submitted 3 weeks after your mother's death. My father couldn't meet anyone's eyes. My mother buried her face in her hands. Brandon finally shouted, "Grandma wasn't thinking clearly." I looked directly at him. She had 2 independent physicians certify her mental capacity before signing this will. Harrison lifted another document. "Both certifications are here." Brandon's confidence vanished instantly. My father finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "We thought." He stopped, then started again. "We thought Brandon needed more help." I stared at him in disbelief. "So you ignored Grandma's last wishes?" He didn't answer. My mother finally whispered the words I had waited my entire life to hear. "We were wrong," but something inside me remained completely still. 3 years ago, those words would have meant everything. Tonight, they sounded empty. Because an apology given only after the truth is exposed is not redemption, it's survival. Harrison quietly returned the documents to me. "Bethany," he said gently, "these records don't just change your family." He looked toward the federal agents. "They establish possible probate fraud and inheritance fraud." One of the agents nodded. "We'll need copies immediately." Brandon staggered backward until he leaned against the wall. Jason watched everything from across the hallway, handcuffed and silent. For the first time all night, neither of them argued. Neither denied anything. Because they finally understood that the investigation had moved beyond Apex Innovations. Their greed hadn't started with the company. It had started inside their own family decades earlier. I carefully folded my grandmother's letter and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I looked at my parents. "You spent my entire life telling me family comes before everything else." I paused, letting the silence settle around us. Grandma was the only one who actually believed it. No one had anything left to say. And as federal agents quietly collected copies of the will, I realized the greatest victory of the night wasn't watching Jason lose his freedom or Brandon lose his reputation. It was finally giving my grandmother the one thing she had waited 22 years for, the truth. The hallway fell completely silent after my last words. Even the officers escorting Jason paused for a moment, sensing that whatever I was about to reveal carried far more weight than the fraud investigation surrounding us. Harrison studied my face carefully. "Bethany," he said quietly, "if there's something else, now is the time." I nodded but didn't answer immediately. Instead, I opened the leather briefcase I had carried with me all night and removed a weathered brown envelope. Unlike every financial report, forensic audit, and bank record I had presented before, this envelope looked old. The corners were worn. The seal had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 4 words. "To Bethany, when you're ready." Harrison frowned. "What is that?" I ran my fingers gently across the envelope before answering. "My grandmother gave this to her attorney 22 years ago." Brandon's face immediately turned pale. He knew exactly what I was holding. "Don't open it," he whispered. Nobody had asked him anything, yet he was already pleading. That alone caught everyone's attention. Harrison slowly turned toward him. "You've seen it before?" Brandon didn't answer. His silence was louder than any confession. I carefully opened the envelope and removed a handwritten letter along with several legal documents. The handwriting belonged to my grandmother. I recognized it instantly. I hadn't seen it since I was a little girl writing birthday cards beside her kitchen table. My hands trembled slightly as I began reading aloud. If you are reading this, Bethany, it means the truth has finally become more important than keeping peace inside this family. My mother's voice suddenly echoed from the far end of the hallway. Bethany, stop. Everyone turned. She and my father had just arrived, escorted into Apex Tower after learning Jason had been arrested. My mother looked terrified. Not angry, terrified. Please, she whispered, don't read it. Harrison looked between us. Mrs. Caldwell, do you know what's in that letter? Tears immediately filled her eyes. She couldn't answer. I continued reading. For years I watched my son and daughter-in-law love one child more than the other. They believed they were hiding it. They weren't. Every birthday, every holiday, every sacrifice was made for Brandon while Bethany was expected to understand, forgive, and remain silent. My father slowly lowered his head. No one in the hallway moved. Even the officers remained still. I continued. I confronted them many times. They promised they would change. They never did. My voice grew quieter. If they still haven't changed by the time you read this, then they never will. My mother began crying openly. Please, she whispered again. Enough. I looked at her for several long seconds before unfolding the final page. Attached behind it was a certified copy of my grandmother's will. Harrison carefully accepted it and adjusted his glasses. His expression changed almost immediately. This, he murmured. This was never filed with probate. My father suddenly closed his eyes. He already knew why. Harrison continued reading. The diamond pendant, the lake house, the investment portfolio, and the family trust. He looked directly at my parents. Every one of these assets was legally left to Bethany. Complete silence. I slowly turned toward Monica, who was still wearing my grandmother's pendant around her neck. She instinctively touched it as though realizing for the first time it had never belonged to her. Harrison's voice became colder. Instead, the probate records show every one of these assets was transferred to Brandon through an amended estate filing submitted 3 weeks after your mother's death. My father couldn't meet anyone's eyes. My mother buried her face in her hands. Brandon finally shouted, "Grandma wasn't thinking clearly." I looked directly at him. She had 2 independent physicians certify her mental capacity before signing this will. Harrison lifted another document. Both certifications are here. Brandon's confidence vanished instantly. My father finally spoke, his voice barely audible. We thought. He stopped, then started again. We thought Brandon needed more help. I stared at him in disbelief. So you ignored Grandma's last wishes? He didn't answer. My mother finally whispered the words I had waited my entire life to hear. We were wrong. But something inside me remained completely still. 3 years ago, those words would have meant everything. Tonight, they sounded empty. Because an apology given only after the truth is exposed is not redemption, it's survival. Harrison quietly returned the documents to me. Bethany, he said gently, these records don't just change your family. He looked toward the federal agents. They establish possible probate fraud and inheritance fraud. One of the agents nodded. We'll need copies immediately. Brandon staggered backward until he leaned against the wall. Jason watched everything from across the hallway, handcuffed and silent. For the first time all night, neither of them argued. Neither denied anything. Because they finally understood that the investigation had moved beyond Apex Innovations. Their greed hadn't started with the company. It had started inside their own family decades earlier. I carefully folded my grandmother's letter and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I looked at my parents. You spent my entire life telling me family comes before everything else. I paused, letting the silence settle around us. Grandma was the only one who actually believed it. No one had anything left to say. And as federal agents quietly collected copies of the will, I realized the greatest victory of the night wasn't watching Jason lose his freedom or Brandon lose his reputation. It was finally giving my grandmother the one thing she had waited 22 years for: the truth. The hallway remained silent long after Brandon's apology faded into the air. No one rushed to comfort him. No one defended him. For the first time in his life, he had to face the consequences without my parents standing between him and the truth. One of the federal agents gently asked the officers to continue processing the arrests, but even they seemed reluctant to interrupt the moment. My mother slowly stood from the chair, her face swollen from crying. She reached into Monica's hands and quietly took my grandmother's diamond necklace. Monica didn't resist. She couldn't. The necklace suddenly felt heavier than anyone could carry. My mother walked toward me with trembling hands, stopping only a few feet away. "This should have been yours all along," she whispered. I looked at the necklace but didn't reach for it. She lowered her eyes. "Please, let me do one thing right." I slowly accepted it and closed my fingers around the cool diamond pendant. The memories came rushing back all at once. I could almost hear my grandmother laughing in her kitchen, telling me that true strength wasn't about winning arguments. It was about surviving disappointment without becoming bitter. Tears finally filled my eyes. They weren't tears of anger. They were tears for the woman who had believed in me when no one else did. My father watched quietly before taking one slow step toward me. "Your grandmother left something else," he said. Everyone looked at him. The day before she died, she asked me to promise that if I ever realized how badly we had failed you, I would tell you the truth. He reached into his wallet and removed a faded photograph. It showed my grandmother sitting between Brandon and me when we were children. On the back, written in her handwriting, was a single sentence: "Never let success cost you your family, and never let favoritism destroy your children." My father stared at those words for several seconds before his voice broke. I broke both promises. No one spoke. Even Jason stood quietly, listening from across the hallway. My father handed me the photograph. "I've carried it every day for 22 years because I kept telling myself there would be time to fix everything." He looked around the hallway before shaking his head. I waited too long. My mother gently slipped off her wedding ring and placed it into my father's hand. He looked at her in confusion. "What are you doing?" She wiped away another tear. "For 35 years we kept choosing the easier lie instead of the harder truth." She looked directly at him. "I'm tired of living that way." My father understood exactly what she meant. Their marriage hadn't been destroyed by Jason. It hadn't been destroyed by Brandon. It had been weakened one compromise at a time. Every moment they chose to ignore what they already knew was wrong. Harrison quietly looked toward the federal agents. "Give them a minute." They nodded respectfully. Brandon slowly lifted his head. "Mom." His voice was barely audible. "Dad." My father looked at him with heartbreaking sadness. "I loved you so much." Brandon's eyes filled with tears. "That I forgot loving one child should never mean abandoning the other." Brandon broke down completely. Years of arrogance disappeared in seconds. "I don't know how to fix this," I answered honestly. "You can't." He nodded, accepting the truth. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life trying anyway." Before anyone could speak again, one of the detectives approached Harrison carrying a folder. "Chairman Cole," he said quietly, "the board has finished its emergency meeting." Harrison opened the folder and smiled faintly before handing it to me. Across the top of the first page were the words, "Board Resolution, Unanimous Vote." I looked at Harrison in confusion. "What is this?" He smiled warmly. "Your temporary appointment ended an hour ago." My heart sank for a moment. Harrison continued. "The board voted unanimously to make you the permanent chief executive officer of Apex Innovations, effective immediately." I stared at him in disbelief. "Permanent?" Harrison nodded. "They didn't choose you because you exposed a fraud." He looked directly into my eyes. "They chose you because every opportunity you had to seek revenge, you chose the truth instead." The hallway became silent once again. My parents looked at me with pride they had never shown before, but it came years too late. Brandon lowered his head. Jason closed his eyes. Monica quietly cried without saying a word. I slowly signed the acceptance letter Harrison handed me. Not because I needed the title. Not because I wanted power. but because for the first time in my life, someone had trusted me for who I truly was, instead of comparing me to the person standing beside me. Harrison shook my hand firmly. "Congratulations, Chief Executive Officer." I smiled softly. "Thank you." Then I looked one last time at my family. They had spent years believing success belonged to Brandon. Tonight, they finally understood that character had always been worth far more than achievement, and that lesson had cost them almost everything. 3 months passed before I saw my family again. Life had moved forward in ways I never imagined. Apex Innovations had survived the scandal, not because people forgot what happened, but because we refused to hide it. Every fraudulent contract was canceled. Every employee involved in the scheme was investigated fairly. We cooperated with federal authorities from the very beginning, compensated investors for every recoverable loss, and rebuilt the company one honest decision at a time. For the first time in years, employees walked through the front doors without wondering who was secretly stealing from them. Harrison officially retired 2 months later, leaving the company in my hands exactly as the board had promised. The day he handed me the CEO nameplate, he smiled and said, "Companies aren't saved by brilliant executives. They're saved by people who refuse to compromise their integrity." Those words stayed with me every single day. Jason remained in federal custody while prosecutors prepared one of the largest corporate fraud cases the city had seen in years. Monica accepted a plea agreement after providing investigators with thousands of internal communications that confirmed Jason had organized the entire scheme from the beginning. She publicly admitted her role, surrendered every asset purchased with stolen money, and quietly disappeared from public life. She never contacted me again. Brandon also accepted responsibility for his crimes. Unlike Jason, he never tried to blame anyone else after the night of his arrest. He pleaded guilty in court, apologized publicly to Apex employees, and voluntarily surrendered every remaining asset he owned so the money could be used to repay victims, including our own parents. It didn't erase what he had done, but for the first time in his life, he stopped running from the consequences of his choices. My parents sold the large family home they had spent decades trying to protect. The money they recovered wasn't enough to replace everything they had lost, but they refused to ask me for financial help. Instead, my father found part-time work at a neighborhood hardware store, while my mother began volunteering at a community center that helped families facing financial hardship. One afternoon, she quietly told me, "For years I believed providing money made me a good mother. Now I know listening would have mattered far more." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. Slowly, without pressure or expectation, we began speaking again. We didn't pretend the past never happened. We talked about it openly. Sometimes we cried. Sometimes we sat together without saying anything at all. Healing didn't happen because someone apologized. It happened because people finally stopped lying. One Sunday morning, my father invited me to visit Grandma's grave. For a long time, neither of us spoke. He simply placed fresh white lilies beside the headstone before quietly saying, "Mom, you were right about everything." His voice cracked as tears rolled down his face. "I spent so many years trying to protect one child that I almost lost the other forever." He looked at me with eyes filled not with guilt, but with understanding. "Thank you for giving us one last chance to become better people." I gently placed my grandmother's diamond necklace against the headstone for a moment, before fastening it around my own neck again. "She never stopped believing we'd find our way back," I whispered. My father nodded. "She believed in you long before the rest of us did." A few weeks later, Apex hosted its annual leadership conference. Standing on the same stage where Jason had once expected to announce his promotion, I looked out at hundreds of employees whose trust had slowly been restored. I didn't speak about fraud. I didn't mention revenge. Instead, I told them one simple truth. Leadership isn't measured by the title on your office door. It's measured by the people who still trust you after they learn the whole truth. The audience stood and applauded, not because I had become CEO, but because every person in that room understood how close the company had come to losing everything. As I stepped away from the podium, Harrison quietly whispered, "Your grandmother would be proud." I smiled through tears. I hope so. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in my office watching the city lights stretch across the skyline. 3 years earlier, I believed losing Jason had destroyed my future. Now I understood something very different. Jason hadn't taken my future away. He had only removed the people who were never meant to be part of it. I reached into my desk drawer and looked at the old photograph of Grandma holding Brandon and me as children. On the back were the words she had written decades earlier. Never let success cost you your family, and never let favoritism destroy your children. This time, I smiled instead of crying, because her words had finally been heard. And although justice had arrived later than any of us wanted, it arrived before it was too late to remind us of something far more valuable than wealth, power, or revenge. The greatest victory in life is becoming the person your pain could never destroy. 5 years later, I stood in the same grand ballroom where my life had fallen apart. But this time, everything was different. The stage no longer belonged to people who lied their way to success. It belonged to employees who had rebuilt Apex Innovations with honesty, loyalty, and hard work. As the audience applauded the company's record-breaking year, I quietly looked toward the front row where Harrison sat smiling proudly beside my parents. Time had changed all of us. My father no longer wore expensive suits or chased business status. My mother no longer cared about appearances or what other people thought of our family. The only thing that mattered to them now was telling the truth, even when it hurt. After serving their sentences, Jason and Brandon had walked very different paths. Jason refused every opportunity to accept responsibility. He blamed the board, the economy, the investigators, even me. Because he never admitted what he had done, the judge denied every request for early release. His appeals failed one after another. Every hidden account was seized, every property was sold, and every professional license was permanently revoked. The newspapers stopped writing about him because nobody cared anymore. The man who had spent his entire life chasing admiration became nothing more than another inmate whose name was remembered only as a warning about greed. Brandon's punishment was different. He accepted every charge, cooperated with investigators, surrendered every remaining asset, and spent years working in prison education programs, helping other inmates earn financial literacy certificates. After his release, he refused interviews, refused television offers, and quietly worked for a nonprofit organization that helped elderly victims recover money lost through financial scams. Every month he mailed a portion of his salary to repay our parents, even though they never asked him to. He once wrote me a letter that said, "For years I believed success meant having more than everyone else. Prison taught me that success begins the moment you stop lying to yourself." I never forgot those words. Monica disappeared from public life after completing her sentence and fulfilling every restitution order. She legally changed her name, started over in another state, and never again tried to build her life on someone else's pain. She sent me one letter shortly before Christmas. It contained only one sentence. "Thank you for refusing to become the cruel person I deserved." I never answered, but I hoped she had finally found the honesty she spent so many years pretending to have. As for my parents, they never stopped trying to earn back the trust they had broken. They volunteered almost every day at community centers, speaking with young families about the danger of favoritism and the quiet damage it causes long before anyone notices. My father often told fathers holding their children's hands, "Never make one child compete for the love you should freely give them both." My mother kept my grandmother's photograph on the living room wall, beside a simple handwritten note that read, "The truth arrived late, but it still saved us." She looked at those words every morning. Harrison slowly walked onto the stage and invited me to join him. He smiled before handing me a small wooden box. "Open it," he whispered. Inside was the original CEO nameplate he had used for nearly 30 years. Engraved on the back were new words he had added himself. "Integrity is the only success no one can steal." My eyes filled with tears as the audience rose to their feet. They weren't applauding the title. They were applauding everything it had taken to earn it. I thanked them, but before leaving the stage, I asked for one final moment. The room became completely silent. 5 years ago, I began. I believed revenge would heal my broken heart. I was wrong. Revenge only keeps you looking backward. Truth gives you permission to walk forward. I paused and looked toward my parents. They were crying quietly, but this time they weren't asking for forgiveness. They were simply grateful to still be part of my life. The people who betrayed me lost their wealth, their reputation, and their freedom. But those weren't their greatest punishments. Their greatest punishment was waking up every morning knowing that one selfish decision destroyed every relationship that truly mattered. And my greatest reward was never becoming CEO. It was discovering that no one can take your future unless you surrender your character. The audience stood again, applauding longer than I expected. After the ceremony ended, I drove alone to my grandmother's grave carrying a single white rose. I knelt beside the headstone, gently placed the flower beneath her name, and touched the diamond necklace resting against my heart. "You were right," I whispered with a smile. "Kindness isn't weakness. Truth always arrives, even if it takes years." A warm breeze moved softly through the trees as the evening sun settled behind the hills. I closed my eyes for one peaceful moment before standing to leave. I didn't look back, because there was nothing left behind that still owned a part of me. The betrayal was over. The lies were over. The pain was finally over. I walked toward my car surrounded not by anger but by peace, knowing that the greatest inheritance my grandmother had ever given me was never the necklace, the company, or the fortune. It was the courage to choose integrity when everyone else chose convenience. And in the end, that one choice gave me everything. The people who betrayed me spent their entire lives chasing, but never found. A life filled with truth, love, respect, and a happiness that no one could ever steal.